Fear and Trembling is one of Kierkegaard's more interesting works because it attempts to analyze one of the most famous stories in the Bible. That story being God's call for Abraham to sacrifice his own son. Many people cherish this story as a beautiful testament of faith, but Kierkegaard puts a much different spin on the story. As always, Kierkegaard's writings are very confusing and require some legwork to understand, so if you haven't watched my video on either or, I would highly recommend going back to watch that before continuing on here. It's vitally important. I also plan on making more videos like this, so feel free to subscribe if you like it. So, Fear and Trembling is a complex work, full of intertwined ideas, so I'm going to be doing my absolute best to make this as simple as I can, and watching the last video will help a lot because he uses many of the same ideas here in Fear and Trembling. So to begin, let's look at a brief summary of the contents of Fear and Trembling. First and foremost, it is not written from Kierkegaard's perspective, but from a pseudonym, as many of his works are. That being said, we have to understand that every thought that is presented in the book may not be exactly what Kierkegaard thinks. Rather, it could be a means of helping us understand the topic from a different perspective. Now, the perspective that he wants us to be reading this from is a Hegelian view, which was one of the more prevalent views of his time. But more importantly, from someone with a Hegelian view of God. Now, if you don't know, the Hegelian view of God is that God is ever-changing as humanity changes. God is eternal in some sense, but he does change over time based on the culmination of all human thinking put together. Now, this perspective inherently assumes that God does not have ultimate moral authority until the end of time, which is something the Bible inherently rejects and definitely doesn't teach. So Kierkegaard is pretending to be someone who holds this view as he reasons through the story of Abraham. As we read, it almost immediately becomes clear that Kierkegaard thinks that Hegel is fatally wrong about the nature of God, and he cleverly uses the story of Abraham to prove it. Some commentators might even go as far as to say that the entire purpose of the book is to show the inconsistencies between Hegel's view and the biblical view of God. This may or may not be true, but I read the whole book with no understanding of Hegelian philosophy and still gained much from the experience, so I wouldn't worry too much if you don't know anything about Hegel either. The lessons in this book are really for all of us. But what we do need to know is that Kierkegaard's pseudonym thinks that faith is absurd, and we will see this as his character analyzes the story of Abraham. Another note that must be mentioned, and this should come as no surprise based on the source material, but this work is completely Christian, so I believe it would be unfair to analyze this book apart from the biblical context that it's in, because Kierkegaard clearly had it in sight as he was writing. Now, as mentioned before, Abraham is really the star of the show for at least the beginning of the book. If you have never read the story of Abraham in the Bible, I would recommend doing that now, because it really is the basis for much of the book. You can find it in Genesis chapter 22, and it won't take more than 5 minutes to read. The short length of the story should indicate that there isn't much information to work off of, but have no fear, we can always count on Kierkegaard to be as wordy as possible. Anyone who has read either or knows what I'm talking about. So, how does Kierkegaard expand this single chapter in Genesis into an entire book? Well, he starts by reading between the lines. He creates 4 different scenarios that speak of what Abraham must have thought between verse 2, where God calls Abraham to sacrifice his son, and verse 3, where Abraham begins his journey to fulfill God's call. As you read these different scenarios, you can tell that Kierkegaard's pseudonym is trying his best to understand the mind of Abraham, but he admittedly cannot understand the faith of Abraham. He is trying to justify Abraham's actions in really any way that could make sense, but under the Hegelian view, this is impossible. The Bible assumes God's authority because God is the pinnacle of moral superiority, but under the Hegelian view, God has no such authority until the end of time. This is why the pseudonym is trying to create these scenarios. He is trying to figure out how Abraham could have done what he did. Now, in the immediate story of the Bible, we don't really get much help because it doesn't try to explain how Abraham feels at any moment in the story. We as the reader are left to try and fill in those details, and this is what the pseudonym is doing. Now, if you remember from the either or video, we spoke about Kierkegaard's definition of faith. how faith requires doubt in order to be true faith rather than blind faith. Well, the story of Abraham is the pinnacle of this definition. Abraham is pinned between two commands from God. He was promised that his descendants would come through Isaac, so when God called Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, it created a bit of a problem. His understanding of the finite world could not allow for these two commands to be true. How could God promise that Isaac would be the means of his descendants if God also wants Isaac to be sacrificed? This is where Kierkegaard comes in and tries to do some reasoning with the 4 different scenarios. But as we will soon find out, there is no good human reasoning to solve the problem. The two commands cannot coexist by any human or finite means. Now this is where we feel Kierkegaard's pseudonym feeling some pressure. Someone with a Hegelian view cannot justify Abraham's actions. If God is the culmination of human reasoning, then there has to be some kind of reasoning behind God's call to kill Isaac, but there is none. If there was some purpose to the sacrifice, then we could maybe find some human reasoning to justify the call. Say, for example, Christ's sacrifice to save humanity from sin and spiritual death. This makes sense because there is a purpose to the sacrifice. But in the story of Abraham, God was simply testing Abraham's faith. God would never do that if he were merely the culmination of human reasoning. This is why Kierkegaard chose this story to break apart Hegel's view. The story of Abraham is completely void of human reasoning. Okay, so if you remember from my last video, we spoke very briefly about mass men, or the Christian mob as Kierkegaard would phrase it. These are the people that called themselves Christian, but never spent too much time thinking about things like faith and never questioned things because they really had no reason to, because pretty much everyone around them believed exactly what they did. Well, this is what Denmark was full of at the time. But worse than that, they were professing Christians while also falling under the Hegelian views of God. Kierkegaard is now showing how incompatible these two views are through the story of Abraham. Now, as you have probably realized by now, Kierkegaard is trying to get these Christians around him to realize that if Hegel is right, then all of these examples of great faith in the Bible are actually just people making absurd decisions, and we should not admire or emulate them. But if they are truly Christian, they can't hold this view because these people are highly praised for their actions in the Bible. Thus, Kierkegaard has just shown that these people must choose the Bible or Hegel to define their views of God. For a true Christian, this should be no difficult choice at all, but for the mass men around Kierkegaard, this was a bit of a dilemma. Nearly all the intellectuals of Kierkegaard's time hated him and mocked him because they were Hegelian. They would call Kierkegaard names and mock him for his appearance, but Kierkegaard stood his ground because of how clear the Bible is on the subject. Hebrews 11 is an entire chapter praising people for their great faith, just like Abraham. The majority of the examples given would be considered crazy in the eyes of Hegel. Hebrews chapter 11, 17 through 19 actually gives some more insight on the story of Abraham. It says, "By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promise was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, 'It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned.' Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead." You see, Abraham had faith that God could even do the impossible of raising the dead. This is something Kierkegaard calls faith in the absurd throughout Fear and Trembling. It is faith that God is not limited to our finite world, and he can even do the impossible. You see, at this point in the Bible, no one had ever been raised from the dead. This doesn't happen until much later. So Abraham's faith gave him the ability to believe even the impossible could happen. A Hegelian could never have such faith and would even call such faith worthless and absurd. So what Kierkegaard is trying to do here is help the Christian mob see clearly. He wants people to either admit that Hegel is wrong or stop calling themselves Christian. Okay, so now that we've hammered that point into the ground, let's talk about some other aspects of the book that I think you'll find very interesting. I would like to draw to your memory another idea from Either Or, and that is the 3 characters. You'll remember the aesthetic hedonist character, the ethical character, and the religious character. Kierkegaard is going to build on them in this work. Kierkegaard claims that the vast majority of people are stuck in the aesthetic, hedonist mode of life. These people really don't have a strong moral code. They usually say if it feels good for them, then it's good, and good comes from within rather than from without. Then we have the select few who are the ethical, who have escaped the hedonist life. In Fear and Trembling, the ethical life is presented as a higher mode of existence where the person understands that good actually isn't dependent on how you feel. Right and wrong are actually based on something higher than oneself. Now this is where Kierkegaard begins to expand on this idea from either or. He presents a character type known as the Knight of Infinite Resignation. Now the religious character is a further development of the Knight of Infinite Resignation, so we will talk about that after we describe what the ethical character is. Now Kierkegaard is going to use some strange symbolism here to describe what a Knight of Infinite Resignation does and looks like. He describes those who live an aesthetic and hedonistic life as benchwarmers, who are consumed on the first level of existence, the finite. Whereas, those living in the ethical mode are dancers who are able to leap from the finite world into the infinite world. The infinite world being ultimate truth that transcends human thought, spiritual truths, and things above us. So the hedonist gets their truths from within themselves, whereas the ethical gets their truths from outside and above themselves. These dancers are on their way to understanding why things truly have value. They are becoming, or are already, Knights of Infinite Resignation. So Kierkegaard gives us a sort of a litmus test to analyze our own hearts, to see whether we are living in the aesthetic mode of life, or if we are on our way to becoming a Knight of Infinite Resignation. He says that anyone who is a true Knight of Infinite Resignation never loses who they really are. But what does this mean? It's really someone who doesn't lose themselves in anything. Nothing consumes them or their soul. The aesthetic person may very well lose themselves in alcohol or womanizing or sports, etc. But the Knight of Infinite Resignation doesn't do that. This isn't to say that they have no hobbies, but their hobbies don't consume their soul. Kierkegaard would say it's actually a contradiction for one to lose yourself in this way and to say that you are still yourself. So in a sense, someone who gives their soul to something is actually selling their soul. Now another key aspect of the Knight of Infinite Resignation is this. They can see the way things ought to be. They see the true value of things, but they also realize that because of the fallenness of the world and the amount of people living in the aesthetic mode of existence, the true value of things will not be realized in this finite world. In this way, they have to resign themselves. They do not get caught up in the impossible perfect world that they can see. Rather, they see it, but understand the impossibility of it. That means they aren't moping around and depressed at the problems in the world. Rather, they are merely aware of the good there could be and continue to live in the imperfect world. So the Knight of Infinite Resignation denies that the impossible could occur. Kierkegaard's pseudonym actually proclaims that only fools and children think anything is possible in the finite world. The Knight of Infinite Resignation does not think all things are possible in the finite world. So if Abraham were to merely be a Knight of Infinite Resignation, he would have never been able to follow God's command. He would be a fool for thinking that God would raise his son from the dead, because it is seemingly impossible. So the Knight of Infinite Resignation is able to leap into the infinite, but is not able to fully grasp what he sees. He may learn spiritual truths and higher morality, but he cannot fully understand what to do with what he sees. He will cling to the things he learns and inwardly know that the mass men will never understand these truths. And this means that he cannot live among them in comfort because of these differences. The Knight of Infinite Resignation may hide himself in a monastery or seclude himself from the world in fear. He will appear more pious than others and may be mocked for it. He may stand against 1,000 men, but he will still hold on to the truths that he has learned. This is what a Knight of Infinite Resignation is, and Kierkegaard writes this almost as an encouragement that all people can become like this if we could only get out of the finite, aesthetic, and hedonistic world and move into the ethical mode of existence. Now, Kierkegaard does not present this as the highest mode of living, but he does say it's still much better than being a hedonist mass man. Whew, okay. So, we are covering a lot here, I understand. but I really hope that you're tracking because it's about to get a little bit crazier. Now we are going to talk about the next mode of existence. We have already covered that the majority of people live the hedonist lifestyle, and we've talked about the small percentage that have made it to the ethical, but now we're going to talk about the religious mode of life, the night of faith. We very briefly touched on this idea in the either or video, so now let's go in depth. The night of faith takes everything we just said about the night of infinite resignation and goes one step farther. So in Kierkegaard's eyes, becoming a knight of infinite resignation is almost an essential step to becoming a knight of faith. I'll do a bit of paraphrasing here, but he essentially says that you must understand your eternal validity through the ethical mode of life before you can even begin to grasp your own existence by the means of faith. To help understand what he means by this, we have to follow the example given in the book. Remember the dancer analogy from earlier? We have the knights of infinite resignation leaping into the infinite for a moment and returning to the finite world. These knights of infinite resignation are leaping, but when they return to the world, their landing isn't perfect, and it takes them a moment to compose themselves before returning to the final pose. However, the knight of faith is able to seamlessly leap into the infinite and back to the finite with no difficulty at all. They perfectly stick the landing every time. So what does all this mean? Well, he goes on to explain that the knight of faith is able to fit into the finite world and be comfortable. He doesn't struggle to see the perfection of the infinite and live in the finite. The knight of faith fits in, so well in fact, that it can be hard to tell if someone is truly a knight of faith merely by looking at them. They aren't what you'd expect them to look like. They aren't overly pious or smug or judgmental, rather, they look just like everyone else. Kierkegaard says that he often looks to try and find a true knight of faith, but he admits that it would be nearly impossible to distinguish the knight of faith from anyone else. They fit in too well, whereas the knight of infinite resignation doesn't do that. They can't stick the landing every time. They often struggle to separate the infinite and the finite and may stick out like a sore thumb because of it. They may walk a little too stiff or awkwardly avoid encounters, and they can't help but be different than everyone else. But the knight of faith has no difficulty here. They blend in seamlessly and are able to enjoy every aspect of the world. Nothing ever bothers them because they see the world through the perspective of the religious. They know that God works all things together for the good of those who love Him and who are called according to His purpose. If they get stuck in traffic, they know that for whatever reason, this is for their good. If they stub their toe, they are able to thank God for it. They do not worry when they are mocked for their faith because they know that they'll be blessed. They have no fear when the news tells them of some impending danger because they understand that whether they live or die, their soul will go on to live in eternity because that is what God has promised through His Son. What fear could they have? They know that if God is for them, then no one can stand against them. This is what a knight of faith looks like. They are content, worryless, unafraid, and composed. This is the highest mode of existence according to Kierkegaard. He pulls symbolism from the fruit of the Spirit found in Galatians 5, which speak of what someone who is led by God will look like. They will have love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. These are all characteristics of a knight of faith. Kierkegaard is essentially just plagiarizing from the Bible throughout the entire work. The hedonist massmen are placed in contrast with the knight of faith, like in Romans 8:5, where it says, "Those who live according to the flesh have their mind set on what the flesh desires, but those who live according to the Spirit have their mind set on what the Spirit desires." You see, the hedonist mind is consumed by their bodily desire, but the knight of faith is consumed by what God in the infinite desires. Now, do you remember how Kierkegaard's pseudonym said that only children and fools think that the impossible could occur? Well, what does Jesus say about what kind of faith we are to have? He says that we must all have the faith of a child. A child trusts his parents with all his heart. Every kid thinks that their dad can do anything, even the impossible. Kierkegaard puts it like this: to have faith is to lose your mind and win God. We are to become fools for the sake of God. We are to believe, just as Abraham did, that God could even do the impossible. We must take the leap of faith in order to become a knight of faith. Abraham is the father of faith and the first knight of faith. He was someone who could hear the command that was so seemingly contradictory and absurd, and yet still believe that God will be able to fulfill his promise even by impossible means. Like Hebrews says, Abraham, by virtue of his faith, reasoned that God would have to raise his son from the dead. In a symbolic sense, God told Abraham to jump off a cliff, and he did. Abraham took the leap of faith. Imagine God told you to climb a mountain and throw yourself off it, but he promised that he will catch you. You may stand on the side of the cliff and you'll hear every fiber of your being and all human logic say, "No, don't jump, you're crazy. I can't see God's hands ready to catch me." But the knight of faith knows that if God makes a promise, he will follow through. They can feel the doubt in their innermost being and yet still fall completely in the direction of faith into the hands of God. Anyone who wishes to be a knight of faith must do the same. That's what a knight of faith is. Wow, okay. So I know we just covered a ton of big ideas throughout Fear and Trembling. We remember how Kierkegaard spoke about Abraham and how he was the original knight of faith who trusted God even through the impossibility of his commands, and the knight of infinite resignation who lives by virtue of the ethical but cannot seem to fully grasp the infinite by means of faith. And of course, we have the mass men of hedonists who are ignorant of anything beyond their own eyes, who are completely consumed and dictated by their fleshly desires. So now, let's watch as Kierkegaard so beautifully ties all these ideas together in one wonderful quote. No one who was great in the world will be forgotten, but everyone was great in his own way, and everyone in proportion to the greatness of that which he loved. He who loved himself became great by virtue of himself, and he who loved other men became great by his devotedness, but he who loved God became the greatest of all. Everyone shall be remembered, but everyone became great in proportion to his expectancy. One became great by expecting the possible, another by expecting the eternal, but he who expected the impossible became the greatest of all. Everyone shall be remembered, but everyone was great wholly in proportion to the magnitude of that which he struggled. For he who struggled with the world became great by conquering the world, and he who struggled with himself became great by conquering himself. But he who struggled with God became the greatest of all. Thus did they struggle in the world, man against man, one against 1,000, but he who struggled with God was the greatest of all. Thus did they struggle on earth. There was one who conquered everything by his power, and there was one who conquered God by his powerlessness. There was one who relied upon himself and gained everything. There was one in the security of his own strength sacrificed everything, but the one who believed God was the greatest of all. There was one who was great by virtue of his power, and one who was great by virtue of his hope, and one who was great by virtue of his love. But Abraham was the greatest of all, great by the power of whose strength is powerlessness, great by that wisdom which is foolishness, and great by that hope whose form is madness, great by the love that is hatred to oneself. Alright guys, thanks for watching. I hope you're inspired to try and become a knight of infinite resignation with even higher aspirations of one day becoming a true knight of faith. I of course am working on that myself. I plan on making more videos like this, so if you enjoyed, feel free to subscribe and let me know what you think about Kierkegaard's ideas in the comments. Have a good day.